Without the mic. Yeah, I'll just try.
We need the mic. We need the mic.
Oh, you do need the mic?
We need the mic for the recording.
Oh, okay. Well, all right, I'll do the best. I'll do the best I can then. But I lived so many of the years of my life in Washington, D.C., so this is a familiar part of the country. And in fact, my best friend all those years was from Richmond. And so coming back today and driving through the streets, it just seemed like home in many ways. The talk I'm going to read isn't as forbidding as it sounds from the title. It's a chapter from my new book, which is going to come out from the University of Chicago Press next fall, and is called Unoriginal Genius. And the reason it's called Unoriginal Genius is because, you know, it's very fashionable these days to say there is no genius anymore. Genius theory is dead. You know, there's no individualism, post-humanism, all that. But unoriginal, because the book is about citational poetry. That is, and also not just poetry, it begins with Walter Benjamin, writing that uses other people's writing primarily. And there's a lot of that. There's a long chapter on Susan Howe and her work. And so, but this chapter is particularly on citing from other works. And you'll see there's a big section in it on Eliot and Pound, which may seem more familiar than some of the later part. So there are two, and I'm sorry we had trouble with the computer because I forgot my little cord, but we now have it set up, so it should be okay. I hope you can see, but these are just so you can't see while I read them. The first epigraph is from Benjamin's about translation. The limit, music needs no translation. Lyric poetry closest to music and posing the greatest difficulties for translation. And it's interesting to think about that, how with lyric poetry we always say, well, it can't really be translated. Everything is lost in translation, and yet music, of course, isn't translated that way, so we can talk about that later. And the second one comes from Yoko Tawada, from an essay on the Spree, the river, the Spree River. And I translated a lot of these things. German is my native language, so I don't get very special credit for that, but I was born in Vienna, and so my book is back there, The Vienna Paradox. Anyway, so I translated some of these things. With the Warsaw Express, I arrived at the Berlin Zoological Garden, zoo, and discovered a B in Berlin, a C in Zoologischen, and an A in Garten. The alphabet always reminds me of the Middle East. Willem Flusser wrote, the A still shows the horns of the Syrian steer, the B still the cupolas of the Semitic house, the C, G, still the hump of the camel in the Near Eastern desert. Now in this passage, and it comes from a book called Sprachpolizei and Spielpolyglottie, so speech police and polyglottal play. It's being translated now, speech police and polyglottal play. Yoko Tawada recalls her first view of Berlin, the view of a writer born and raised in Japan, who at the age of 22 came on a visit to Germany and never went back. That is her story. She came just sort of on a lark and stayed. For Tawada, a native speaker of a language whose grammar makes no distinction of gender, case, definite and indefinite articles, or singular and plural, indeed that uses no prepositions, each German, more accurately, each Western word, phrase, or idiom becomes a conundrum. The alphabet itself poses a special, how does this go? Okay, poses a special challenge. Tawada cannot resist the tendency to ideogramize the individual letters of the modern alphabet, whose Near Eastern roots provide a link to her own Far Eastern world. This is the Phoenician alphabet. I just took it from Wikipedia. It just comes from online. So I just wanted you to see, you know, what it looks like. Aleph, if you read from right to left. Beth, Gimel, in their derivations, the names of these letters seem fitting, given that our Western numbers are, of course, Arabic numbers. The introduction of foreign language citations into a given piece of writing is hardly new. From the references to Latin text in Thomas Browne's Religio Medici, to the transcription of the French conversation of the upper classes in Tolstoy's War and Peace, to the network of foreign allusions in Eliot's The Wasteland, we're accustomed to a poetry or fiction that exceeds its monolingual borders. But there's a significant difference between the function of the foreign citations in The Wasteland and their role a century later in the global context today of shifting national identities, large-scale migration from one language community to another, and especially the heteroglossia of the internet. Because on the internet, all kinds of languages, of course, come up and people communicate with each other. The writing of poetry under these circumstances calls for a new set of language games. And this first section is called The Language Vortex, Eliot and Pound. Now for Eliot, the role of foreign language citations, in his case almost exclusively Latin and Greek, Italian, French, and German, is to heighten the authenticity as well as the exoticism of the illusion in question. When, for example, Eliot cites near the end of The Wasteland, Gérard de Nerval's sonnet El Desterrado, Le Prince d'Aquitaine à la tour abolie, you all know it, the Prince of Aquitaine at his broken tower, as an analog to the poet's own sense of dispossession, the French original is designed to give the reference a mysterious aura, as well as a certain distance, as if to say, my immediate feelings can best be expressed in the words of this remarkable and enigmatic 19th century French poet. And the Nerval reference is, in its turn, collaged into a sequence of allusions ranging from English nursery rhyme, London Bridge is falling down, falling down, falling down, to Dante's Purgatorio, to the late Latin of the Vigilum Veneris, and finally the Sanskrit of the Upanishads. Actually, Craig Raine remarks, the poet Craig Raine remarks in his little book on Eliot, the range of registers here introduces us to the auditory equivalent of the Silk Road and the Spice Trail. The exotic is in our mouths and in our ears. Now, such self-conscious and learned linguistic display has its own curious limits. Note, for example, that when Eliot refers to the Old Testament, as in the citations he himself identifies as stemming from Ezekiel or Ecclesiastes or Isaiah, the source is hardly the original Hebrew or Aramaic, but rather the King James Bible. And I found that very fascinating. I'd never really thought about it before. I'd never really heard anybody talk about it, but it's just taken as a given that, after all, Sanskrit is in Sanskrit, and yet if it's Hebrew, it's not the Hebrew Bible, but the King James Bible. Partly it's a matter of historical and cultural circumstance. Eliot knew no Hebrew, and neither did his classically educated audience. But it's also a telling omission. Whereas a Wagner citation, Frisch weht der Wind der Heimat zu, in the first part of The Wasteland, evidently required the original German, the Hebrew prophets had long since turned into native English speakers. Indeed, the foreign language citations in The Wasteland, culminating in the esoteric transliteration of data, dayadvam, damyata, give, sympathize, control, and shanti, shanti, shanti. Eliot's note tells us somewhat pretentiously that the peace which paths understanding is our equivalent to this word, are more epidectic than integral to the poet's and poem's meaning. If, in other words, the momentary note of transcendence introduced into the fire sermon, in the citation from Verlaine's Parsifal, et ô ces voix d'enfants chantant dans la coupole, and oh, the children, the voices of children singing in the dome, in the cupola, had been rendered in English, the tenor of the passage in question would be unchanged, but its foreign aura, enhanced by the assonance of open O's, O, coupole, and the rhyme of enfant chantant, would be lost. Now, The Wasteland depends on such effects. The language shifts inevitably, slowing down the reader's absorption of the text and countering the speed of the collage cuts. But Eliot himself seems to have felt that the polyglossia of The Wasteland had its limits for the self-consciously English poet he had become by the time he wrote the 4 quartets. The collage mode, with its tissue of literary allusions, the Italian of Dante, the Latin of Ovid, the French of Baudelaire, had all but vanished in favor of the authoritative and largely pure English of the poet's maturity. Here is a place of disaffection, time before and time after, in a dim light, neither daylight investing form with lucid stillness, with slow rotation suggesting permanence, nor darkness to purify the soul, emptying the sensual with deprivation, cleansing affection from the temporal. That comes from Burnt Norton, the first of the quartets. It does have 2 Greek epigraphs from Heraclitus. Subsequently, although there are plenty of buried allusions to earlier poems, like St. John of the Cross, there's only a single foreign citation in the entire sequence, 20 years largely wasted, the years of entre deux guerres, in East Coker, Part 5. And that French phrase was hardly esoteric, entre deux guerres, between the wars, in the British parlance of the time. And in my opening chapter, actually, I talk more about this because I think one reason that Eliot got rid of all the foreign words in the Wasteland is he got a lot of flack. The early reviews of the Wasteland were devastating. They said, what is all this stuff? What do we want all these foreign words here for? What's it doing here? And it just means he couldn't think of anything himself, and so on. And the reviews were not good. So when Eliot sort of remade himself, was no longer an American poet, but adopted the British accent and became a kind of British Anglican royalist poet, he got rid of the foreign words very much too. Now, the multilingualism of Ezra Pound's cantos is of a very different order again. If Eliot carefully embeds the foreign, usually literary illusion, inside what is, of course, an English poem, Pound produces a multiform text whose language layers intersect so as to give the meaning of a given passage. The Malatesta cantos, I gave you a snatch from that here, 8 to 11, are an early case in point. Their astonishing blend of English, Italian, Latin, up-to-date American slang and dialect, along with business English, create a wholly distinctive verbal texture, especially since the translations of florid Renaissance letters are rendered in a hyper-formal English that functions parodically in the context. I don't know how well you know Pound or whether you've studied Pound a lot, but I'll just go through this a little bit. This is the conclusion to Canto 9. That's what they found in the post bag. The whole canto deals with the letters that Sigismundo Malatesta, the great lord of Rimini, wrote to various people. And of course, he's adjusted the letters in various ways. That's what they found in the post bag. And some more of it to the effect that he lived and ruled. And then comes the Italian. Ed amava perdutamente Isotta degli Atti, e ne fu degna, constans in proposito, placuit oculis principis, pulchra aspectu, populo grata, Italiaque decus, and built a temple so full of pagan works, i.e. Sigismund, and in the style past ruined Latium, the filigree hiding the Gothic, with a touch of rhetoric in the whole, and the old sarcophagi, such as lies smothered in grass by San Vitale. Now, he lived and ruled, in the third line there. The short phrase, cut, it seems, from a longer sentence in the Chronicle, that was Pound's source, is intentionally flat. Of course he lived and ruled, but what and how? The casual to the effect that is now punctuated by a dramatic passage in Italian from Pope Pius II's commentaries, and in English, and he loved to distraction Isotta degli Atti. She was finally his great mistress after he supposedly poisoned a few others, and so on. E ne fu degna, and she was worthy of him. Here the shift to Italian heightens the immediacy of the Chronicle, the ability to love so perdutamente, so lost really, is presented as compensating for Sigismundo's earlier crimes, especially since Isotta is pronounced by the Pope himself to be deserving of such love. In the next line, Pius's Italian account shifts abruptly to Latin, and you get constans in proposito, constant in purpose, and that refers to Horace's Odes 3. I put it up for you just to see. Justum et tenacem propositi virum. I'll just read it in English. The man tenacious of his purpose in a righteous case is not shaken from his firm resolve by the frenzy of his fellow citizens bidding what is wrong, not by the face of the threatening tyrant. From Odes number 3. Now that phrase is one that Pound also used at the conclusion of Canto 34 to praise John Quincy Adams. Constans proposito justum et tenacem. The references to the ivory cane with the gold ring around it, presented to John Quincy Adams in 1844, engraved on the ring were the words, to John Quincy Adams, justum et tenacem proposito virum. And in Canto 34, which you have here, the epithet constans proposito is accompanied by the Chinese ideogram at the bottom for integrity. In seamlessly linking the authoritarian Horatian reference to Pius's praise of Isotta degli Atti's legendary beauty and charisma, she is populo, let's go back to it a minute, populo grata, which means pleasing to the people, and an ornament to Italy, the poem presents Sigismundo's beloved as a lady of great constancy and righteous resolve. Indeed, a few lines later, with the quotation, past ruined Latium, which is a paraphrase of the Victorian poet Walter Savage Landor's great Victorian poem, Past Ruined Ilium, she becomes another Helen of Troy. Now, it's the shift of the in language registers throughout this passage that produces the equivocal image of Malatesta's Renaissance Italy, Rome, Byzantium, 15th century Rimini, and 20th century America are juxtaposed on a single plane, even as Pound's proto-hypertextual poem can relate Malatesta to John Quincy Adams, can link the free verse of Canto 9 to the pyramidal frame of Canto 34, papal commentary to Chinese ideogram, the acoustic to the visual. Is it too loud? I'm sorry. I just put it too close. The method, as the poem itself tells us, depends upon the filigree hiding the Gothic, with a touch of rhetoric in the whole. Pound's language reenacts the role of the delicate tracery on the stone carvings of the Tempio, making strange the seemingly familiar Gothic church. And I'm sure if Pound were alive today, the internet would have, of course, been the perfect medium. You would have made it into a hypertext. You could look up all the things. You jump from one thing to another. The same things appear in canto after canto, so that although it seems hard, it all begins to fit. Contemporary multilingual poetics owes much to Pound, especially to his anticipation of digital linkage in the creation of narrative assemblage. Still, however many language registers Pound introduces into the cantos, there's never any doubt but that the voice that orchestrates these ingenious variations is a well-versed, an expert English speaker, a speaker whose voice moves easily between the imperative of lie quiet divas in Canto 1 and hang it all Robert Browning in Canto 3, Canto 2, to the personal narrative I sat on the Dogana's steps, the opening of Canto 3, or the parenthetical I wonder what Tsutsei's calligraphy looked like in Canto 80. It's this voice that playfully reminds us of the name of the famed Oxford College, Maudlin rhymes with Dawdlin, spelled differently, and imitates the president of the college conversing about a modern poem he had read. Now, such comic spellings testify, of course, to the power of both poet and reader to distinguish between proper English and mispronunciation, between correct speech and comic accent. Linguistic idiosyncrasies in languages ranging from Chinese to Greek to contemporary French argot and American Western twang are, in other words, measurable against a norm. We could laugh at Pound's reference to Clemenceau as the frog ambassador. He's the French ambassador, so he's the frog ambassador. Because we know that frog is a slang epithet for French, and that the reference is thus to the French ambassador. Or again, Pound's imitation Spanish accent, when he recalls that back in 1906, a certain Padre Jose Elizondo told him, "Hay aquí mucho catolicismo," sounded catolicismo, y muy poco religión, strikes a resonant note because the poet knows all about the difference between spelling and pronunciation in Peninsular Spanish. Again, when we come to the fragment, which is a theme song in the cantos, Le paradis n'est pas artificiel, paradise is not artificial, we understand that the statement is made in French because it alludes to Baudelaire's well-known book on hashish, Les Paradis Artificiels. The possibility for paradise persists, but it is now shifting to Italian, appropriate for Pound's location in the detention camp at Pisa, spezzato, broken, apparently. And in the next line, the authoritative voice of the poet remarks wistfully, it exists only in fragments. All right, now this next section is called Questions of Travel. Carolyn Bergvall, Say Parsley. But what happens when there is no more commanding voice to assess those fragments? In a world of relentless global communication, poetry has begun to concern itself with the processing and absorption of the foreign itself, given the vagaries of travel and migration, whether of persons or of speech samples and forms of writing. Consider the work of the French-Norwegian poet and conceptual artist Carolyn Bergvall, who moved to the UK, to England in 1989 when she was 27. That's what we're talking about. A graduate of the Sorbonne, Bergvall received an MPhil from the University of Warwick and has made her main home in London ever since. She comes to the United States quite a lot. She's here a lot at different places giving readings. She was just at Buffalo and in New York doing various things. In her recent collection for Salt Press called Fig, 2005, there are three important multilingual poems: the English-French About Face, which I've written about elsewhere, the arrangement of Dante translations called Via, and the text of the installation piece Say Parsley, which I'm mainly going to talk about now, and then Yoko Tawada, which was first commissioned for the SpaceX Gallery in Exeter in 2001. Via which I talk about also elsewhere in my book, Differential, is a constraint-based text that follows certain rules, entirely composed of citations, specifically the 47 English translations of the first tercet, and you've got it here, of Canto 1 of Dante's Inferno, nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita. Mi ritrovai per una selva oscura, che la diritta via era smarrita. By arranging the translations alphabetically, she arranges them by the first letter of the first line, beginning with one that goes along the journey of our life halfway, regardless of chronology, and placing the last name of the author and date in parentheses following the citation. Bergvall has produced an astonishing text that demonstrates just how impossible and yet how inevitable translation is. Dante's Selva Oscura is alternately dark, sunless, darkling, gloomy, great, obscure, shadowy, and darksome. There have been dozens of translations of that. The direct road, the via diritta may be the nearest road or the right road. The direct road or the proper path. The road is smarrita, lost, blocked, strayed from, not to be found. All those things fit the meaning here. The cited translators range from famous 19th century poets like Longfellow, she has 1867, to contemporaries like Robert Pinsky, 1994, and include established translators from Henry Francis Carey, 1805, to Alan Mandelbaum in 1980, and all kinds of obscure figures, James Innes Minchin, 1885, or Geoffrey L. Bickersteth, 1955. Equalized by the alphabet game and de-individualized by the omission of the translator's first name, these cited tercets, and some are rhymed ABA, as in the original, in terza rima, some are in free verse, some are in prose, convey the brilliance of the original, whose every word resonates with possible meanings, even if they produce an independent poem written in a curious midway doggerel, repeatedly rhyming variants like midway and astray, and beginning lines with amid, in the middle of, and halfway, so that sound chiming produces a kind of chant, offset every fourth line by the discordant sound and image of an ordinary proper name and date. During the writing process, some 2 years in all, Bergvall recalls in her headnote for Fig, it was as if the many systematic acts of counting and collating were carrying with them a motive interior as much as ulterior to the work being generated. The minutiae of writing, of copying out, of shadowing the translator's voicing of the medieval text favored an eerie intimacy as much as a welcome distance. Increasingly, the project was about keeping count and making sure, making copy explicitly as an act of copy, understanding translations in its erratic seriality. Of course, what this does for me mostly, as I say, make you realize how untranslatable. You can argue it either way. The Divine Comedy is. Now in mezzo, it's been, you've all seen the translations of this by Pinsky and so forth. But in the middle of the journey of our life, I found myself in a selva oscura, as I said, that has so many resonances that if you say dark journey, it really isn't the same. None of the translations can quite do it. On the other hand, she really kind of creates her own work that begins to resonate in all kinds of ways, and it's interesting. Now, Say Parsley, the work I'm going to talk about now, begins at the opposite end. If Via collates and assembles translations of Dante's Italian text, Say Parsley takes a finite body of English words so as to understand their potential for translation, whether into various idiolects and dialects circulating in England or in the warring speech registers of Belgium, specifically Flemish-speaking Antwerp, where English has replaced French as the second language of choice. That interested her particularly, and I was in Belgium recently, and it is absolutely weird. I'm in Belgium for so long, it was really mostly French speaking, but now it's mostly Flemish speaking. It's all a whole political thing. The French are kind of reviled, and if you walk through the streets of Antwerp and you ask somebody the directions in French, they often don't answer or don't want to, and yet to us, the people look, there doesn't seem to be much difference. They're all the Catholic religion is the religion in Belgium, and so it's very strange, and they do know English pretty well, so they will speak English, whereas if you go to Liège or places in southern Belgium or even whatever the other cities or the main cities, it's quite different again. So it's a kind of differential text. We have the print version, a series of installations that she did, one at Exeter, then Liverpool in 2004, and Antwerp in 2008. and a digital sound screen version on the internet. You can see it right on the internet. The whole thing is there. You can both see the images for it, and she's going to be doing it again in a new version someplace, I forget now what the gallery is, but also in the United States. And a digital sound screen version. A translation and translatability are viewed in political as well as poetic terms. Now, Bergvall's headnotes, like Susan Howe's, move easily from documentary fact to poetic play. In exploring speaking patterns, slips of the tongues of the culture, Bergvall takes as her point of departure, before I even put this on, I should say this, the shibboleth. The meaning of a shibboleth. The Hebrew word shibboleth literally means the parts of a plant containing grains, such as an ear of corn, or a stalk of grain, or in different contexts, stream or torrent. It was used in Judges, the book of Judges, in 12, by Jephthah as a test word by which to distinguish the fleeing Ephraimites who could not pronounce the sh of shibboleth from his own men, the Gileadites. As such, it came to mean, this is just a meaning in the OED, a word or sound which a person is unable to pronounce correctly. A word used as a test for detecting foreigners or persons from another district by their pronunciation. Now here's Bergvall's own comment on shibboleth. Speaking is a giveaway. My tongue marks me out. It also trips me up, creates social stuttering, mishearing, ambiguities. Say what? The shibboleth provides an extreme case of speech as gatekeeper. The massacre of tens of thousands of Creole Haitians, and this is interesting in view of Haiti today, on the soil of the Dominican Republic during the dictatorship of Trujillo in 1937 is still perhaps the most recently documented example of such a shibboleth at work. For failing to roll the R of perejil, parsley, this familiar anodyne word makes the horror all the more disturbing. In Creole, the language of the Haitian peasant, R is pronounced like W, and there's no Spanish J, so it's pronounced hard against the back of the throat to give us perejil. Now, one language, shibboleth, is another's everyday speech. The Haitians were punished, many of them were killed and executed because they couldn't pronounce this word. So the word parsley was the key word by which they were distinguished from the citizens of the Dominican Republic and either sent back to Haiti or killed. In English, the word parsley is readily articulated, even as the parsley plant is one of our most common. Bergvall, herself an exophonic poet, writing in her second language, her first having been French and some Norwegian, or secondary language, is keenly aware of subliminal shibboleths. And she said, in the culturally pluralistic yet divided and markedly monolingual society of contemporary Britain, variations in accent and deviations from a broad English pronunciation still frequently entail degrees of harassment and verbal, sometimes physical abuse, all according to ethnic and linguistic background. And believe me, that's true. It's not as true in England as it used to be, but I remember I lived in England for a year now, many years ago, where if you had a Yorkshire accent, now the BBC has sort of become all accents, and you went to London and tried to rent an apartment, they would say, "Are you a Britisher, sir?" Because you had that accent, and that was considered kind of taboo. So accent was very, very important. For the Exeter version, Bergvall and her collaborator, Sharon Maher, made recordings of speech overheard in London cafes and shops, choosing words on the parsley model for their, quote, tricksy, difficult yet familiar English association, say rolling hills. The thick English L and liquid R are especially prone to pronunciation variations. The reference is to the fact that the Japanese language, many of you know, as well as other East Asian languages heard increasingly in the UK, does not have separate sounds for the L or R phonemes. If you've ever studied linguistics, you know that. Or it's really the same sound, it's just one is frontal and the other is back. And in Japanese, the R sound is pronounced as an alveolar lateral flap, articulated with the tongue flapped against the hard palate behind the front teeth, so it sounds like a soft Spanish R. Because the Japanese language does not have a separate equivalent to the English L, Japanese speakers not fluent in English are often unable to distinguish between the R and L sounds, and they often mispronounce English words containing either sound, leading to endless ethnic jokes. Election is confused with erection, a clap with crap. Flight attendants tell passengers to have a good fright. And they're endless jokes, kind of really nasty jokes when you think of it, but the most famous one I know is the waiter in the restaurant is given the menu and said, you come tomorrow and you know how to pronounce these words, otherwise you can't be hired. And so he comes back and the owner says to him, all right, now say this. And he looks at it very carefully and he says, fried rice, you pricks. So goes that way. So there are endless jokes about that, fried rice. Now, say parsley was designed as one response to the particular form of discrimination, especially in England, much less here, that often goes with that. This quote, we worked out pairings of words which were likely to yield the most variations on hearing. Pairs with dissimilar speech resonances. Proper English, nothing certain. Speak freely. The way the loudspeakers were placed on two walls, let me show you that, and I'll come back to it. We'll come back and look at it. The loudspeakers were placed on two walls in the farthest room, each carrying only one word per channel, spoken an octave apart, was a classic psychoacoustic setup. Listeners were caught in their own ears, creating their own sense of what they heard, moved around the room, piecing together the pairings, only to discover more words in the recesses of their hearing, their memory ear. Some thought they heard Italian words, others Hungarian. Hidden or disused first languages resurfaced in their physical and social comprehension game. A grid of plumb lines, pendula, pong, ping, punctuated the upper floor. Now, the accompanying poem, and we'll come back and look at some of these, the accompanying poem, which is reproduced in the book Fig, defamiliarizes ordinary speech by means of rhyme, pun, paragram, misspelling, typo, and fragmentation. Say this language heals, language keels over, swallow in if, hollow, hollow, follow, speak slowly, lie low. Say this feels loose, the big most, the chokes, has a bong struck in the throat, spooks, lulls, anguish, language, pulls teeth out for the dogs, keep watch, rats at the gate of the law. Say pig, say this inflamed gorge. And now follows the imperative, say pig, and I'm going to show you this, followed by 31 other 1- and 2-syllable words, most of them quite common, and many rhyming, varying by single phoneme, like crumple, rumple. I wrote these all down, but if you hear them, if you hear the recording, which you can do right online, you will hear them. A rhyming culminating in the line, say parsley, finally at the bottom. A subtle difficulty is built into the catalog, of which more in a moment, with pairs such as gurgle, turgle, where the first word is a common onomatopoeic noun or verb, while the second is urban slang for sneaking up behind someone and grabbing their backpack. I only knew that because I looked it up on Google. English slang, British slang, grabbing their backpack and pulling it down and shaking it, called turgle, like John turgled the guy in the bathroom vigorously, turgle. The print version does not record the polyglot phonetic transcription of the words in question, but the recent presentation of Say Parsley, installed at the Museum in Contemporary Art in Antwerp in the summer of 2008, provides an astonishing turn of the screw. In this Belgian city, where Flemish and Dutch vie with the English that is the lingua franca of the non-natives, Bergvall's vocal rendering of the spoken English list prompts a set of translations that reveal a great deal about the way we process language and the shibboleth. Now here, I would play you the video. We're not going to have time for that, and I don't know that I can do it here anyway. But basically, what she does is you hear her reading all the words, pig, fig, and then they write down what they hear. So it's like an experiment. She goes through all the words and then backwards, and they write it down from pig to parsley, and then she goes back in the third column. Now, and the words come up on the screen, and she says them, trumpet, you see? Here they are. Now, and here is the list of words. Now, what's interesting is the listener-reader first assumes that the pop-up menu in column 2 from pig to parsley, which then reverses from parsley to pig in 3, provides phonetic translations into Flemish of the spoken English words. But the transcriptions generated don't seem to follow any particular rule. You see that? Fig, 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 fag, vog, fog, vogue, frog, frock, frig, frick, trig, truck, trim, drum. Why, if you hear trim, why would somebody say drum? Tram did come out as tram. There doesn't seem to be any rule at all. Indeed, the more one listens, the less the transcription in question makes sense. Why, for example, should tramp become trap, whereas trumpet is understood as trumpet? I don't know. More important than this was really funny. I found I couldn't copy this list. It took me forever. Now, why couldn't I copy it? When she reads it out loud, and you can play this yourself online and hear it, you just hear her saying fig, pig, and so on. And I started copying it down. Just her words. The other words aren't there. They're here. But I couldn't do it. And the reason I couldn't do it is when you hear it and then you're seeing a video, you hear it one way and you start writing and then there's the video and it just confuses. So finally I had to turn off the sound, and that's the only way I could transcribe them at all. It just wasn't working. No matter how hard I tried, I turned off the sound and just looked at the writing on the wall. So I would get things like this one, Parchi. So I just then wrote them down myself, but it probably took quite a while. I was fooling around. I was just kind of having fun doing it. I don't know why I got started doing it, but I couldn't understand why it was so hard to do. But when you hear the sound, you write something else. You don't really get it right. Now, so ingrained is the English word in my mind that I could not follow the foreign transcription while hearing the familiar sound. So when she said partly, and then I would see this, I somehow couldn't write it down. I would write partly instead, you see, because I'm so used to it. It's only after listening dozens of times I realized that the list of words, both read continuously by Bergwald forward and backward, doesn't stay the same. That's the other reason I couldn't copy it. You think she's just reading it over and over again. No, it keeps changing. So when portal, you see portal down there, 4 from the bottom? It can be portal, but then when she read it from the bottom, parsley, parchi, parsley, it becomes borstal. Not the same word at all. So I thought, well, that's funny. It's the same word in English, but it's being heard differently. Puddle can be pummel or boodle, and so on. So I asterisk the words that change there when the list is reversed. Then to the reverse list, the last 5 words, frog, fog, fag, fig, pig, going up, see? Going from bottom to top, revert to the correct English. Why is that? Has the audience caught on? Is the recorder broken? Or are these monosyllabic words with their short vowel sounds ending on the voice stop G easier to repeat? Say parsley. Parsley gives us the structural key here. For after the first 4 monosyllabic words, fig, fag, fog, frog, the R's kick in. They're present in the next 28 words, whereas L's occur in 19 of them. The alliance of R and L, see that? As in partly, parchi, parchi, creates special problems for the foreign listener reader. But even here, no rule applies because parsley comes out perfectly. The word parsley comes out correctly, but a lot of the others don't, and it's as if they're confusing R's and L's and confusing other things, so they write down something else. So this version of Say Parsley calls into question some deep-seated language assumptions, and that's what she wanted to show. First, Bergwald questions the notion that the division between Flemish and French speakers in Belgium is, as many now think, inevitable, that the nation can or should be divided according to language lines. The transcriptions in our list above are equivocal. Are they Flemish? Kronkel looks sort of Flemish to me. I don't know Flemish really. Are they French? Vague up there, top number 2. Vague is a French word. So some seem to be French. Some might be Flemish. Or like Parchi, they might be spoken by African immigrants. Can the word truly identify a true Belgian? On the evidence of, say, parsley, phonetic transcription and by extension real translation seems on the contrary to be impossible. Every time one recites a rhyming echo in list, there's slight variations. As in Gertrude Stein's Arthur of Grammar or stanzas in Meditation, time makes the difference. Repetition is never precise reproduction. Say it over and over again. Say parsley, say parsley, say. It'll change. And yet in our culture, such words can become shibboleths, used to discriminate against those perceived as outsiders. Language as conduit thus becomes language as object, a fig to contemplate. That object, however, remains curiously opaque. To hear the English word makes it all but impossible to see its foreign visual equivalent. In this kind of cagey and poetic construct, a kind of chant that haunts the eye-ear, sound, far from underscoring sight, almost always undercuts it. Now you're going to have to listen to it yourself to see that, but you'll see. You'll see her saying this list, and then these words shoot up on the screen, and you think partly, parchy, and some of them are so close, and some of them are really quite different. Cuddle, you see cuddle kind of 2/3 of the way down. Cuiter, curdle, girdle becomes coital. So it becomes transcribed different ways, so that not being able to pronounce a word and what that means becomes interesting. Now, what fascinated me, and I didn't know this till after I had read this paper sometime, is that Rita Dove has a poem on the exact same topic, and it's called Parsley, and it was published in '82 in her book Museum, and it couldn't be more different. It is a narrative poem about El General, and it sort of tries to tell the story as a historical narrative. The general looked out the window. The general saw that there were people there who didn't belong, who were not part of the country, and he said, we will have to kill many people. So on the one hand, you have this kind of, and it would be an interesting exercise to compare those and see the difference. She's telling the story straight. That is, she is assuming, and I would argue, and many of you will disagree with this, but I would argue that you can't make up that kind of historical narrative very readily today. In other words, she tries to get into the mind of the general. What would he say? How did he feel about the Haitians? How did he feel about the Dominicans? What was he going to do at this time? How was he going to punish people, and so on? Whereas her Say Parsley really doesn't talk about the actual incident at all, but tries to take that incident to do something else, to do something rather different. I guess the basic idea being that it's hard today, kind of in the internet age, to tell to make up a historical narrative that is going to be convincing in that way. And we can talk maybe later about why. Okay. Now this next section is called Traces of Cultural Collision, the Language Games of Yoko Tawada. Trumpet, trumpet. Bergwall's Antwerp audience could get at least some of her spoken words right. But what happens when the poet's adopted language has no common elements with her mother tongue? This is the case with Yoko Tawada, the Japanese poet and fiction writer who took the Trans-Siberian train from Tokyo to Hamburg in 1982 when she was 22 and stayed in Germany, now writing in her second language. She comes to the United States quite a bit. A number of her novels and short stories have been translated by New Directions. Poetry is harder to translate, and many of her things, and these are the ones I'm going to talk about, are actually sort of prose pieces that are more critical essays and which will be translated and which are very interesting because whether you deal with her own work or not, they're things you can apply to other things. Critical poem essays have as their great subject the role of what she herself has called in a Japanese book by that title, which has not yet been translated, exophony, and here is a quote from that. And the extract is translated by the Japanese poet, and I happened to meet him last week. It's such serendipity. He was at Stanford last week for a thing we had on Octavio Paz and Geraldo de Campos on Blanco Paz's poem, Branco, the translation, and he happens to be in residence, and he has done a lot with Spanish poetry. His name is Kejiro Suga, S-U-G-A, a very interesting poet in the United States for a few months and then going back, but who lives in Tokyo. And he translated Yoko's essay. To write, and I give you a big quote because it hasn't been translated yet. To write literature is at the opposite end from repeating and recombining arbitrarily the words that you hear on a daily basis. It is an attempt to face and confront the possibility of the language in which you write. By consciously doing so, the traces of your memory are highly activated, and your mother tongue, your older linguistic stratum, intervenes to transform the actual language you use for creation. When I write and read aloud sentences in German, by searching the correct rhythm, my sentences come out differently from the usual natural-sounding German. And that would be true for English, too. People say my sentences in German are very clear and easy to hear, but still they're not ordinary and deviant in some ways. No wonder, because they're the results of sound that I, as an individual body, have absorbed and accumulated by living through this multilingual world. It is of no use if I tried to delete my accents or remove my habits in utterance. Today, a human subject is a place where different languages coexist by mutually transforming each other, and it is meaningless to cancel their cohabitation and suppress the resulting distortion. Rather, to pursue one's accents and what they bring about may begin to matter for one's literary creation. Now, in Tawada's case, the situation is further complicated by the fact that hers is an Asian language, a language most Westerners even today feel no obligation to learn. Perhaps, she argues, this can be turned to an advantage. Quote, when a writer whose mother tongue is a minor language begins to create in a major language such as English, a certain change occurs in the target language. A lot has been written about that recently. When you do use minor languages, and Japanese is in a sense a minor language in that fewer people in the whole world know it than they know English, what happens to the target language? The change is not limited solely to the linguistic level. A particular take on history or a new sensorium to grasp the magical comes into literary language. The smallest, simplest words take on special importance. As Tawada says in an interview with Bettina Brandt, this was in Comparative Literature Studies, the German word for to translate, übersetzen, can also mean to steer a boat from one shore to the other. In Japan, we use honyaku for to translate, which is a Sino-Japanese word, a word of Chinese origin. The first ideogram of this word suggests a slightly dramatic and romantic gesture, which means to turn over or to flip over, not simply turning a page. In performances, I like to read my work in several languages, including in the available English translations, and I hope to visualize the act of translation through this gesture. Now, she often performs with one of her translators like Susan Bernofsky, Bettina Brandt. She was at Stanford as the poet at the Humanities Center in residence, and so she did a number of performances with different people, and the audiences were really very enthusiastic, sort of tapping into various languages that would be used. Now, in keeping with this gestural poetics, Tawada's 207 book, which is now being translated, and it's called Speech, Police, and Polyglot Play, begins with the poem Slavia in Berlin, in which ordinary German street conversation is viewed from the angle of the foreign visitor who processes simple directions and bits of information according to the place names they contain. Now, this is hard if you don't know German, but hier Ägypten es aber kein Prag. Egypt, Ägypten is the name for Egypt. Here, Egypt, but no Prague. But if you hear it quickly in German, it sounds like here there is Ägypten, hier gibt es kein Prague. Ich werde sie schon finden, to find it, which sounds like Finland. So gibt es in Finland, like to find, finden. In the sentences, here there is no Prague, I'll find it. Or again, San is in San Francisco, San Diego. She is mesmerized by that, is understood as the first syllable of the German sanatorium, which we have too. San, what does that peculiar prefix mean? San, saint. It's a playful introduction, but the next piece from which I translated for you, An der Spree. The Spree is the river that divides central Berlin and used to divide, of course, East and West Berlin. It's a kind of dark, disorienting piece, and this is the opening. I translated it. I am in Europe. The Spree is also where the Museum Island, I don't know if any of you have been to Berlin, the Museum Insel, the Museum Island, where you have the Pergamon, the great museums are on this island in the Spree, and you have East Berlin, West Berlin. I'm in Europe. I don't know where I am. One thing is sure, the Near East is quite near from here. The place from which the Near East is quite near is called Europe. When I was still living in the Far East, the Near East was quite far. But this too was a mistake. The Near East was not so far from the Far East as was thought in the Far East. The Silk Road rapidly connected one point to another. So the old imperial city Kyoto was built by the Persians who migrated beyond China to Japan. Kyoto is thus a Persian city. The Near East is the place that is near everywhere. Europe lies there where the Silk Road ends. Now, Tawada's seemingly simple prose is a variant on a kind of almost Wittgensteinian language game. Here's a passage from Wittgenstein from the Philosophical Investigations. Someone coming into a strange country will sometimes learn the language of the inhabitants from ostensive definitions that they give him, and he will often have to guess the meaning of these definitions, and will guess sometimes right, sometimes wrong. And now I think we can say Augustine describes the learning of human language as if the child came into a strange country and did not understand the language of the country. That is, as if it already had a language, only not this one. Tawada's narrator poses precisely such an innocent, one who has not yet learned what the term Near East refers to. But of course she knows quite well, just as she knows that the name of the downtown railway terminal, Berlin Zoologischer Garten, refers to the Berlin Zoo, and not to an image of camels as figured in the G's and C's of the printed name in the epigraph I gave you. In juxtaposing the Augustinian equation of word and thing to the Wittgensteinian axiom that the meaning of a word is its use in the language, the poet is able to confront the fissure or collision between her two words. Now, Anders Spree begins with a meditation on numbers, the Chinese numbers of her childhood that have no zero in Chinese, the straight with diagonal lines that make up Roman numerals, and are used sequentially to designate train tracks in the station. See, we don't even notice that. She got very disoriented because the numbers of the train tracks were in Roman numerals, but the trains themselves were in Arabic numerals. And they used sequentially to designate train tracks, and the more advanced Arabic ones to identify the different trains. The Indian numbers, top of the page, wandered toward the west. In the west, the Arabs took over these numbers and spread them around Europe. Since then, those in Europe can do arithmetic quickly. You can see right away who has more and what's better, so that we in the Far East have a kind of inferiority complex because we can't do math as well. Now, what then is this thing called Europe? In the course of Tawada's prose poem, it emerges as the Arabic zero, missing in the poet's mother tongue. Its Siamese twin, the Near East, haunts it everywhere. Witness the dragon of the fabled Ishtar Gate in the Pergamon Museum, right in the middle of the spree. Second quote up here. It had the eyes of the fish and the body of a cat. The forelegs reminded me of a lion, the hind of an eagle. A horn and two crooked ears graced the head. Sorry, I was misspelling there. His tongue was split 3 ways. He was thus multilingual. From here, his place of birth is not far away. He came to Berlin from the Near East and was named the Striding Dragon. Now, as soon as the summer sun comes out, the water of the Spree turns bright blue, reminding the narrator that its waters eventually will turn into the Nile. Everything is connected, and yet the division between East and West Berlin, still experienced by the narrator as she rides on the U-Bahn, spells out the lack of real connection. Contemplate her impending visit to America, where she has an East German Sorb friend who refers to Kleist's Marquise of O as the Marquise of Zero. She anticipates the view of the Pacific, her ocean, and yet entirely different from the one she knew as a child. Besides, the water doesn't remain where it is now. Another water flows into it. It moves as if clouds above it move. And yet in a bookshop where she buys 2 postcards, one of the Brandenburg Gate, the other of the former building site of the Potsdamer Platz, she reads about a Berlin artist who has tried to produce his own clouds in his studio, and she reads this, and it's evidently easy. 1, fill a glass case with dusty air. 2, spray it with water. 3, stir the mass of water and air. 4, let sit for a while. 5, carefully take the mass out of the case. 6, set it in the open air, even better, right away on a mountain, so that the cloud doesn't have far to rise. A newborn cloud doesn't have much strength. The artist painted the clouds the color of the national flags because he thought even the clouds had an ideology and a history. The clouds put on trousers when they fly to Russia. Now, that last sentence is an allusion to Mayakovsky's great poem, The Cloud in Trousers, and brings the narrator back to her Berlin reality. On the U2, she goes to Pankow, and she checks into a pension, sort of a seedy place, on the Mayakovsky ring. Again, a circle, again, 0. At her desk in her rented room, she writes a postcard. I will stay here, but I don't know where I am. She writes a second card. I'm coming to you, but where are you actually? And now we read this quote, if there is a 0, one knows that there's an empty place. If there's no 0, one is overlooking a free place. That's why one cannot, without 0, orient oneself to do arithmetic well. I draw a 0 on a piece of stationery and wrote next to it, look, the 0 is India. The Far East is exactly as far from point 0 as is Europe. The 0 in the middle on the left, the Near East with its Europe. On the right, the Far East. This is a symmetrical picture. Now I know where I am. Now, no wonder the poet concludes that in the far west, California, a third of the computer scientists are from India. They operate between 0 and 1, whereas I sit on the East Coast on the Spree and have still not understood what 0 is. The abacus, after all, knows no 0. You push a stone from the bottom to designate 1. When you get to 5, you push from top to bottom. There's no stone that designates 0. A stone is never less than a stone, but is 0 less than 1? 0 in German, null, swallows the phrase, whether something is less or more. So like numbers, words have a meaning only within a given system. This is what she tries to show. Only relationally, east, west, far west. It all depends on your perspective. The Museum Island on the Spree in Berlin, the recently divided city, the Mayakovsky Ring, now Yoko's home, was once the seat of the East German government, can be viewed as the great crossroads or as an empty circle, 0 itself. Or again, Berlin is the site of sinister collision. Even the clouds, after all, wear trousers. Now, her language is not like that of many of her Asian American contemporaries whose work you've probably seen, Teresa Ha-Kung Cha, Mi-Young Mi Kim, a mongrel language. She writes entirely in German, but a German whose ordinary words, especially proper names, are everywhere measured against their absent Japanese equivalents. Now, the last thing I want to just talk about a little bit is a lyric essay she wrote, because I thought it was so remarkable, called The Metamorphoses of Heidenröslein. Heidenröslein is the famous poem by Goethe and song by Schubert. And if we have time, you can, again, there are at least 45 versions of Heidenröslein on YouTube. There are rock versions, there are the Schubert version, which goes, Sein Knapp and Mädchen auf der Heiden, Heidenröslein, goes like that. And it's set to music by Schubert. Every German school child learns it by heart. And she knew it because she knew it in Japan, where there was also a version of it, and that version is on YouTube. And actually, if we have, I think I can go online here. I may play it for you in a minute, but we're a little behind. And there's a Japanese video sung by Herman Weng. And here the key word is Heiden. Heidenröslein. Heiden means pagan, heathen. Goethe's is a wild rose, one that grows on the open heath or meadow, Röslein after Heiden, and it appears each time twice in the refrain. And here is the actual German poem. Now, I know most of you know German, but I'm just going to read the first stanza for you. Sein Knapp ein Röslein stehen, Röslein auf den Heiden. War so jung und morgen schön, lief es schnell, es nachzusehen. Saß mit vielen Freuden, Röslein, Röslein, Röslein rot, Röslein auf der Heiden. A boy saw a rose, a little rose, with the diminutive saying, on the heath, on the wild grass. It was so young and beautiful, he ran to see it close and saw it with much pleasure. And then comes the refrain. And then the boy speaks, I will break you. And she answers, Röslein sprach, I will prick you, so you'll always think of me, and I won't tolerate it. And then comes again the refrain, rose, rose, red rose on the heath. And the wild boy broke the rose, and she defended herself and pricked him, so no wooing and eyeing helped him. Kein Weh und Ach. He has to tolerate it. Röslein, Röslein, Röslein rot on the heath. Now, Tawada said she learned this song in Japan, where the first two lines became Warabeva mitari no naka no bara. And you can hear it on YouTube. And in YouTube, when you have it, there are meadows and flowers, and it's very pretty, but it's very even. There's no stress, no strong stress at all. The three-syllable word warabe means knabe, boy, but Japanese uses no article and omits the verb saw. And the word for Röslein is not repeated. So the music, Tawada notes, forces an unnatural accent on the third syllable of warabe, as later on other syllables, so that the Japanese words lose their separate identity, and the sense of Goethe's poem more or less evaporates. Such loss of identity, Tawada suggests, has its value for the reader-listener begins to notice things that may well escape the poem's Western audience. Goethe's ballad, based on medieval folk ballad, has invariably been read as a love poem. Like so many rose poems in our tradition, the rose is the beautiful and desired girl. She blossoms, ripens, is plucked by the amorous male, and dies, whether literally or figuratively. Goethe's biographers usually read it in the light of the poet's youthful affair with Friederike Brion, the innocent young daughter of the village pastor, and that's the model for Gretchen in Faust, who, becomes pregnant, she's impregnated and has the baby and commits suicide, and it's all terrible story. And rape, it's usually often taken as a rape story. Now, Tawada's own reading of Haydn and Röslein has to do with her own understanding of the word die Heiden, in the second line there. The plural known derived from Heide, wild meadow or heath, meaning heathens, pagans. When in the 16th century Catholic missionaries came to Japan, she remarks, perhaps they thought that the heathens had to be converted to Christianity before they would stop plundering the earth of its fruits. Haydn, she posits, relating Haydn and Röslein to other Goethe lyrics, as well as to the novels, Werther, and Elective Affinities, is regularly related to conversion. Our current slogans, Save the Forests, or Save the Children of the Third World, always imply that those to be converted are heathens, or at least those others who have not yet seen the light. In this scheme of things, it's important that the word Röslein is grammatically neuter. It isn't die Rose. In German, it would be feminine, but Röslein, neuter. It. Tawada knows very well that in German, grammar and gender don't always match. In German, the sun is feminine, die Sonne. The moon, der Mond, happens to be masculine. But the neuter case of the diminutive Röslein provides a case for the flower's bisexuality. Then, too, this little wild rose is no shrinking violet. In stanza 2, Röslein warns the boy that if you pluck me, I will prick you, and furthermore, ich will's nicht leiden, I won't tolerate it, I won't stand it. In stanza 3, the wild rose fulfills this threat, and in the enigmatic lines 18-19, we read that no moaning and groaning, kein Weh und Ach, helped him that he has to stand it. He had to put up with the pain. The will to violate the flower, in other words, does not go unpunished. Now, Goethe, as Tawada knows, was no sort of Christian. His concept of redemption always involves recycling rather than removal. Thus, at the climax of Faust II, the pagans in the form of fauns, witches, giants, figures from Greek mythology, cast a spell that brings the rose petals strewn on Gretchen's grave back to life. It is in this sense that Gretchen is saved. The revenge of nature is real. As the Haydn Röslein warns its destroyer, he will have something to remember it by. It's an ingenious argument she makes for an ecological reading of a poem and song usually understood as the generic lament for the transience of beauty and love. But it's not the persuasiveness of Tawada's argument, qua argument, that is at issue here, but rather the role such creative reading plays in her own poetics. The point about Haydn would not be, indeed has not been noticed by the native German speaker. It's only in making it strange that a writer who writes in a second language raises the deeper issues of both reading and writing poetry. Indeed, so careless are our usual reading habits that in actual transcriptions found on YouTube, they usually misprint. They usually, instead of "im," say "ia," so that it looks in that second stanza as if she is the one who can't tolerate it and is killed. And it's amazing that critics like David Welberry have misread this poem as being about a rape and always take the pronouns wrong because they're just not even paying attention to it as closely. So a phony makes a big difference. The title of Tawada's Speech Police and polyglottal play was originally written as an homage, and I'm going to end with this, to the great Austrian experimental poem Ernst Jandl, a wonderful poet, who's been translated by Rosemary Waldrop and is readily available in various anthologies. Der und Die is riffed upon by Charles Bernstein in his Shadow Time. And the collections of poems have titles like Rechts und Links, left and right, and Laut und Luise, loud and Louise, the pun being on leise, soft, provided Tawada with a set of generative citations in the essay itself. And so the book is framed as a set of questions, the key essay, which she's always asked by well-meaning friends and colleagues. Does the Japanese language have a grammar too, or do people speak without any rules? How do you mean? Is there gender? No. Are there plural and singular? No. Is there a declension? No. Are there prepositions? No. Definite, indefinite articles? No. Is there botany in Japan, or do plants grow without rules? So alien is a language without those Western oppositions, masculine, feminine, singular, plural, definite, indefinite article, and without prepositions, that Japanese evidently strikes Germans, indeed any Europeans or Americans, as having no grammar at all, and hence the absurd question about botany. In return, Tawada cannot understand why nouns should be masculine or feminine. Do words have wombs? And we'll come to some of these, especially since gender is so often arbitrary. For instance, in German, der Rock, the skirt, is masculine. Die Hose, pants, are feminine. Now why? You know, those can be traced back, but these things are often, like in French, completely arbitrary. So she has a very hard time learning them or understanding why. The words themselves, as we saw in the case of Emini and Heidenröslein, give way to paragrammatic possibilities. Suppose the poet wonders you were to separate the two words in the compound Radfahren, to ride a bike. When you prefer to write the two words together or writing a tandem. Here comes a policeman who says it's against the law to ride a tandem on the new streets of the inner city. Why? We've always used a tandem before. We can't divide the bicycle in half. Or she gives this example. The stubborn, and she's very literal that way. So by being that literal, she, for instance, wonders about the word Mundharmonika, mouth harmonica, playing the harmonica. Suppose you divided it differently, it would become Mundhaar, mouth hair, and Monica, Monica. What is a mouth hair? A hair that grows in the mouth? And she plays on all these various things. So the book, and especially the leading essay, she asks things like, what if you write Anna, the name Anna, with two small A's and then two small N's? Then Anna becomes as small as Alice in Wonderland. Or again, something, and you have this here, I gave you, something, the length of a word can be measured by the number of its letters. Leben, life, has 5 letters, whereas Krankenversicherung, which is health insurance, has 19 letters. Krankenversicherung, that's a long one. So what's the relationship between the two? Leben is short, insurance is long. What does that mean? And how does one learn what a given suffix might mean? Many adjectives end with ant, significant, redundant, elegant, and those are the same in German. Elegant, arrogant, but then you have elephant, ends the same way, but that's a noun. How do you learn those things? It complicates the issue even further because everyone must refer to native speakers for whom the meaning of a word is its use in the language. For the exophonic poem, such commonsensical notions as that one cannot call somebody my elephant friend, or that she gave an elephant speech, takes some time to learn. And when the distinctions become clear, they may be precisely the locution the poet wishes to use, as when the narrator of Beckett's How It Is refers to a llama emergency dream, or an asparagus burst abscess. You do have those nouns used that way. Now, having invented language games for the adjectives and adverbs, the small qualifiers like nur, and I'll end with this, only just, and the homonyms and antonyms, Tawada concludes her meditation with a kind of letrist passage that goes like this. A sentence is a form of power. A word is a riddle. A letter is a traveler. He can leave the sentence. In his stead comes another. A G is replaced by a P, so Gott becomes pot. A P is exchanged with a G, so your record, Platte, becomes a smooth disc, glatte Scheibe, smooth surface. You cross the border between I and R, between a long and short vowel, between Ö with an umlaut and E. The Lord, der Herr, is no hell, Hölle, hell, and he doesn't go there. But the Lord, der Herr, knows what has happened in hell, der Hölle, the genitive. I suddenly remember the Japanese word jigokumimi, which translates literally as the hearing of hell, das Hören der Hölle. It means someone who's hard of hearing, who can only hear well when someone speaks badly of him. So clear hearing, Hellhörigkeit, also takes you to hell. The punishment occurs because of the confusion between Hölle and hell. Catholic grammar waits eagerly for the punishment and deliberately plays the wicked child. So Hölle, Hören, Herr, Höll, hell here, Lord, light. Substitute these words for one another, and remarkable things happen. Hölle, it turns out, needn't be hell. Last year's words, we read in Eliot's Little Gidding, belong to last year's language. That's an important admission on Eliot's part. And in ABC of Reading, Pound insists that good writers are those who keep the language efficient. That is, keep it accurate, keep it clear. For these great modernists, efficiency and renewal went hand in hand with a cleanup operation, the poet's aim being, in Eliot's words, to purify the language of the tribe. But in the 21st century, purity can hardly be the norm, given the polyglot speech of our tribe, of citizens. On the contrary, if poetry is, in Pound's words, the most concentrated form of verbal expression, if it is language charged with meaning to the utmost possible degree, the charge must include continuous infiltration and translation, a watchful steering of one's boat from one shore to another. Say parsley. Thank you. Sorry, that was so long. What?
We don't know what's happening. Oh. Do you have a question? Oh, it's a question phase.
Q&A. I'm sorry. Yeah.
How long do you think it compile all this?
Well, I had worked on Yoko Tawada a little bit, and it doesn't take that long in the sense that I can do it with German the way you would do it with English in a way. It took a while to, and I'm not a translator particularly, it took a while to translate some of these things, but I was working on Ernst Jandl, that's another part of my book, who's such a wonderful poet, and I guess, let me put it in some kind of context for you all as American, contemporary poets. I guess one of the reasons I feel this is important, not because I feel you have to read or Carolyn Bergvall or Yoko Tawada, but so much poetry that is written today, well, I guess at any age, is so slack. It's so careless, I feel. Well, the words just aren't used. They're endless fillers of the da-da-da, where I just want to take a pencil and take the words out. I mean, I'm not a poet, but your poetry teachers probably, sort of do that anyway, and there's just a feeling that you're not so aware that it's how you say something, after all, that's what poetry is, that really matters. And by working with something foreign like this, or something else, you become so aware that in all great poetry, whether it would be, if it's Robert Frost, or whatever it would be, or something contemporary, if it is, since we mentioned before, if it's in Robert Lowell, Caned by Milltown, we lie on mother's bed. The rising sun in war paint dyes us red. Look at how carefully the words Milltown, which was the first of the tranquilizers, is used there. Tamed by Milltown, we lie on mother's bed. The rising sun in war paint dyes us red. There's really no wastage of words there. But I think it is the thing that is most lost, in at least a lot of what I see today, so that I'm very conscious of a kind of funny time we're living in where, write a poem about this or whatever, and everybody's very worried. What is it about? Is it about the Iraq War? Is it whatever? But meanwhile, using words often very carelessly, I think. And so this is a kind of way, I guess that's why I wanted to do this. I know it may seem pedantic in some ways, as having, all that material. If that makes any sense.
Could you comment on what you said about reading the
Yeah. I've never particularly cared very much for Rita Dove's poetry. I don't think she's a very interesting poet, but I hadn't even really thought why. But I think I have a little quote from that I can give you in a footnote. Her poem, just a minute. No, I don't. But, okay, if you take a story that is so extreme and you want to recreate this particular awful story about General Trujillo and what he might have thought and what he would think, I don't really see how, in other words, he might have said something to me, if you were going to do it as a historical poem, he might say something completely irrelevant or use four-letter words or whatever, but it wouldn't be as clear as the general said, now let's kill so-and-so, and he's standing in his room and he has his hand on paperweight. It's rather histrionic, and it doesn't move me very much, as that kind of poem usually does. And I feel in general that the story is too extreme, and also she wanted to show, what Carolyn Bergvall wanted to show, is this is not just the story about Haiti and that particularly shibboleth, but all shibboleths. This is how they work. It interested me a lot, as I say, having been in various places where people are so cruel about people's accents. And because I'm foreign myself, I guess that's one reason it interested me. When I was a child, and I talk about this in my book, I used to sort of help my mother sometimes, learn American pronunciation. And the refugee joke used to be that all the refugees said, die Bell hat geringt. When they finally learned a little English, the bell has rung. Die Bell hat geringt, they would use partly German, partly English. But how hard it is to learn those phonemes. For instance, our S sounds, or certainly our R and L sounds, but the German ach, ich, so on, are almost impossible. We say ich, if you learn it at all. Or the same thing in French. And it's something one has to be so aware of. And since poetry is always language charged with meaning in some way, I think it's a very important thing, and Caroline has done it in other poems. Her big new piece is on Chaucer. It's not on Dante, but I don't know if any of you have heard any of it or seen some of it in print. She does The Wife of Bath's Tale, and she partly uses the Middle English and plays on it in all kinds of ways. And it helps if you've ever read Chaucer, but even if you haven't, it's very funny, and it's a sort of feminist poem. And so she uses those things. Now to get back to Read It Up, well, why do these things? Why not just write a straightforward poem? And we could talk about that forever, and it's a thing that comes up because we have, and I argue this in Radical Artifice, which I think is back there, which I wrote already 10, 15 years ago, when we have as much language as we have coming over us in the media and the endless cliches, you feel that if you're going to make language new, you have to really reconceive it. You can't just retell these stories. Otherwise, why have poetry at all? And I feel that way about a lot, sometimes, poetry that is written. If you want to write an editorial about what's going on in Iraq or whatever, in Afghanistan, write it, and it might be more interesting in that way. But if I'm going to read a poem at all, or bother with it, or for that matter, fiction, the same thing in fiction, it has to do something, and it can't just repeat in that way. So that I felt, it was funny because I didn't know she had written a poem on that same subject, and one of my own creative writing students at USC, where I'm teaching right now in retirement, where they have a PhD program in creative writing, which some really wonderful students doing all kinds of things. It's Amaranth Borsak, who is a poet in that class, who pointed out to me, she said, did you know Rita Dove wrote a poem about it? The irony was it was on the poetry website that week, on poetryfoundation.org. So a couple of months ago, there it was on the website. I don't know why, that 1982 poem by Rita Dove. And it's not, it's bad, but isn't that interesting that two such different people wrote a poem, on the very same thing? And I asked Caroline if she knew it, but she didn't, but she doesn't know contemporary American poetry that way. Let me say one other thing. She herself comes, and of course, in a way that's unfair, not out of an environment of poets, but out of an environment more performance art, installation art, all kinds of things of that sort. Now she taught at the Dartington School of the Arts, and she has taught in all kinds of programs here, but poetry programs now. But it might be unfair. You might say, well, she's more of a performance artist than she is a straightforward poet. So it's a different kind of milieu. Yoko Tawada is more traditional in certain ways. She came and did a thing at the MLA. She does write short stories that are a little bit like some of these I've shown you. Novels, where Europe begins, where Europe ends, sorry. Is it begins or ends? Begins, right, begins. And some others, and she's done a lot of poetry in both Japanese and German. I didn't bring that in today because, of course, that's hard to translate. Yet in another language, it's going to be hard to translate. But she does seem to come to the United States a lot and do a lot of things, and she is I think she has been in the country recently, somewhere in Cornell, I can't remember. So she visits universities a lot. I think she was at Virginia in Charlottesville. It's just, another mode of being, and then doing these performances. So it is more a performative mode, but that I think speaks to a lot of people now. So in a way, it's not fair to compare to a poet like Rita Dove as a straight.
Rimbaud is published by Poetry.
I can't hear, what?
Rimbaud is published by Poetry Press, it's not necessarily by... Caroline is published by a poetry publisher.
Yeah.
Which said that affects the context of the journal.
Yeah.
As opposed to...
Yeah, it recontextualizes it. Well, and they're always going to be, and she also writes a lot, she's written quite a bit of critical prose. On the Journal Jacket, probably many of you know the Journal Jacket, John Trench's, online Journal Jacket, which Brian has certainly been in, right? Been in Jacket. recently? Yeah. Carol Burwell has numbers of things. In fact, and How To, the Women's Journal, How To online, How To, founded by Kathleen Fraser and now edited, I forget by who. Recently, after I wrote this, there's a Carolyn Burwell sort of special issue with a number of essays and new works that she's done. And she's always working on something new. I've seen her a lot recently because she's been in LA because she's doing an installation at the Hammer Gallery. They have installation, she's doing it with a male artist named Rodney, an African-American artist, Rodney Young. And they're working on it still, so I don't know how that's going to turn out. And it's strange for me to hear how they do it. They'll sort of bounce ideas off each other, and then they'll do something with it, and then they'll change it. Now, of course, also many of these are works in progress that they change. You know, when she's going to do Say Parsley again, she said it's going to be a little bit different, taking into account some of the political things that have happened. But she's often called a conceptual poet, and she doesn't really like that phrase, by the way. She doesn't like to be grouped with Kenneth Goldsmith and Vanessa Plays and some of these people, because she says that she doesn't really think that's what she's doing, because she's very much a very strong feminist and she wants to do things that speak more, than some of these things do. So it gets complicated. Yeah.
Well, as we're talking about that, I was sort of thinking about Birdwall and the performance writing, and sort of the definition of performance writing, which is, it's writing that performs out of those contexts. I think we make a parallel with Tawada and the way she uses language.
With what?
With Tawada and the way she takes the language and sees it perform outside of its context as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Although it's interesting that when Yoko Tawada, they were both at the same MLA session in 2006 when I was the president of the MLA. I had invited them both. I mean, there were lots of other people. But Carolyn Burwell thought that Yoko Tawada was very traditional. First she said, no, I don't think I like that. Not my kind of thing. It's kind of traditional. Because she did read a short story there. And I said, no, look at it again. And then she realized, oh no, I'm wrong on this. So it's funny, and I don't know what, Yoko has a piece in my book, which I don't know if it's back there or not, the one I edited with Craig Dworkin on the sound of poetry, the poetry of sound. I hope some of you will see that. That was based on those MLA sessions, and it has a wonderful piece by Susan Stewart, the critic Susan Stewart, on rhyme, quite additional how rhyme works and why rhyme will always come back, which I thought was very interesting. And it has pieces on all kinds of poetry, Renaissance poetry, piece by Richard Seabrath. But anyway, Yoko Tawada has a piece in there that I hope you'll get to read. Well, it's in English that Susan Bernofsky translated on radio. She's done a lot of works in Germany for radio plays and radio, where she talks about when you read a piece, somebody else's piece, and it sort of enters your body, it works one way, but when you read your own piece, you have a curious distance to it where it doesn't seem as close to you as sometimes when you read something else. And she in general talks about sampling and voiceover and what happens, in radio thing. And that's a very interesting piece that brings up a lot of things that I hadn't thought about, where she deals with other people's radio pieces and that kind of performance with both radio and video and so on. Also in there's Ruben Gallo's piece on Cocteau and radio in Mexico, which I thought was a very interesting piece and quite different. And the funny thing is, and this shows what's going on today, when I gave these assignments, I thought everybody was going to write about prosody in traditional poetry. And I myself in the introduction talk about Yeats, still my favorite, perhaps in many ways. And Craig Dworkin and I did it together. But anyway, I more or less wanted just people to look at the sound and analyze sound in the poems we all read. But most of the people ended up writing about curious other kinds of things, so that Craig Dworkin writes about a Canadian poet who stutters and manages to use the stutter as part of his prosody. And that's a very strange piece and very interesting. And then Joanna Drucker, who used to be at Charlottesville, is now in LA. Joanna Drucker did a piece on, which you could argue, you always have to look at the visual. Poetry is also visual, and the visual is always going to count, which I agree with. But she feels there are then visual pieces that you don't have to talk about sound at all. And in the same issue, Ming-Chan Ma, who's now at Buffalo, writes exactly the opposite, that if you read a poem, and then it breaks and there's an illustration or a diagram, like in Christian Buck's crystallography, what sound goes through your mind? And I said, why does any sound go through your mind? But he said it does. That in fact, you always are hearing something, that if you analyze that. So he tries to figure that out. So he and Joanna are sort of talking opposites that way. And then there are things on, how successful translation can be, and there are just all kinds of pieces on Junte Wang has a piece called Chinese Whispers on Pound's poetry, beginning with the game telephone and how things get transformed when you whisper in somebody's ear and the word changes and things change, and he applies that to, he asked the question, which again people don't usually ask about Pound, what happens when you have these dollar signs or you have plus signs or arithmetical things, which you have in lots of people's poetry. How do you read that out loud? That happens in somebody like Susan Howe. What is the sonic equivalent to the visual there? How does that work? And if you read it out loud, is it the same when you see it? So there's so many interesting problems that come up that way. And Yoko Tawada does ask a lot of those things. And it never really had occurred to me how difficult it is to learn a foreign language when people tell you, okay, San Quentin, San Francisco. But she knows that prefix, but she saw it in sanatorium where it refers to sanitary and sanitize, and so why does it have that different meaning? Very, very hard, and forces you to really think of how words are made and how strangely they're made, because we take all that completely for granted, right? As native speakers.
Well, no more questions?
Thank you.